Environmental Justice Rulemaking Stakeholder Meeting. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting before, I am Olivia Glenn, our Deputy Commissioner of Environmental Justice and Equity at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And before we begin today's meeting, I want to ensure that everyone is aware that the meeting is being recorded and that by joining this meeting, you are giving your consent for this meeting to be recorded. And we do post the recordings of these meetings publicly on our Office of Environmental Justice webpage. So we are convened today to engage in focused stakeholder discussion on one specific aspect of the environmental justice law for rulemaking, namely environmental justice impact statements. This is building on a platform of the passage of the environmental justice law, the nation's first environmental justice law, on September 18th. The law does not go into effect until we adopt rules, and today's discussion is a continuation of the process that gets us to rule completion. If you missed any of the past meetings, you can find links for those on our Office of Environmental Justice website at nj.gov/DEP/EJ. The next slide, please. Please note that closed captioning is available in the Teams platform. You can access it by clicking on the ellipsis. A menu will appear with multiple options. Locate and click on Turn on Live Captions, and then you will begin to see live captions at the bottom of the Teams window. The next slide, please. Our agenda for today is as follows. We'll give you some introductory material and go over rules for engagement. We'll discuss a potential process as well as a statutory minimum timeline. We'll discuss the potential elements of an environmental justice impact statement. And we'll pose some questions that offer you a suite of considerations for how we advance the EJ impact statement process. And as usual, we will leave plenty of time at the end for miscellaneous questions and answers. Our next stakeholder meeting will take place the week of June 21st, and at that time, we'll do a recap of all the different topics that we've raised in our different public stakeholder meetings and allow you to ask us any questions at that time. And for those of you who are just joining, it's just a reminder that the recording has started for this meeting. By joining, you are giving consent for this meeting to be recorded. This presentation, the meeting recording, and a follow-up survey link will be emailed to participants and posted on the Office of Environmental Justice website shortly after the meeting. The next slide, please. So these are our rules of engagement for discussion. So please remain on mute unless you are speaking. It will enable you to hear the presentation more clearly, and it also increases the caliber of our recording. When you want to speak during the facilitated discussion, please use the raise hand function, and you can find that in the ribbon across the top. There is a smiling emoji with a hand like this. If you click on that emoji, you'll see a menu and you'll see a hand raised. You click on that hand, and that is the way you raise your hand. We want to ask that you treat everyone with respect and limit your comment or question to the topic being discussed today. We are limiting comments or questions to 2 minutes, and I will physically raise my hand like this as you approach 90 seconds. And again, please note that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the DEP website after the session concludes. The next slide, please. We are at the point now where I will hand the presentation over to my esteemed colleague, Sean Moriarty, who is our department's Chief Advisor for Regulatory Affairs. So Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner Glenn, and thank you everyone for joining us once again to continue this discussion. As Olivia indicated, this is really the final conversation we're going to have as part of breaking down all the individual pieces of the environmental justice law before we come back to you in a month or so with some proposals in terms of how we think we're going to move forward. So it's a good opportunity. Just, I'm sure we'll do this again, but just to thank everyone for their continued engagement and their willingness to continue to come to these meetings and to give us your feedback. So let's dive right into it. So as Deputy Commissioner Glenn indicated, we're talking about the environmental justice impact statement process today in a bit more detail than we have previously. Obviously, a big portion of the law and a big portion of what the department is going to need to write in these regulations, and really a major aspect of what facilities and individuals in the industry are going to have to deal with as part of what this is going to look like in the regulations. So what we did last time, what we're going to continue to do is just put this process up here just to kind of act as a bit of a guide and give us a framework for our discussion. We've tweaked it a little bit since the last conversation, so I'll walk through it again, but the basic tenets still remain. So we talked about before, kind of step one in this process is an initial screen. That's where that publicly available data tool that we're working on, the one that allows us to map out the presence of overburdened communities, as well as to add on the stressor data layers that we're working on comes into play. That's going to allow folks to pull up addresses, to pull up block groups, and make determinations, at least on their own, about what the stressor levels there and stressor levels are present in those overburdened communities, and what a potential environmental justice impact statement process and ultimate permitting process might look like as a result of those stressors. Step two, what we're going to talk about in more detail today, is the environmental justice impact statement process, and that's through the development of the environmental justice impact statement. That includes public comment and a hearing in the overburdened community. The applicant would assess whether and how the proposed facility would cause or contribute to adverse stressors in the overburdened community that are higher than the appropriate geographic point of comparison. Again, kind of hearkening back to step one, where we're determining whether that would be state, county, or some other geographic point of comparison. And if so, the applicant would need to propose measures to avoid or eliminate those impacts. If that cannot be done, then and causing or contributing to those higher stressor levels can't be avoided, then a disproportionate impact is present. Go to the next slide. We've after some feedback from stakeholders last time, and frankly my lack of clarity on this, we reconfigured a little bit of what we were talking about as far as steps 3 and 4 last time. We've combined them, I think, into something a bit more logical. Step 3 just being department review, and what that department review is, of course, broken down into 2 pieces: 1 new facilities and 1 existing or expanded facilities. And this is really just a recitation generally of what we've been talking about, as well as what's called for by the environmental justice law. For new facilities, the department is required to deny unless there's a demonstrated compelling public interest in the overburdened community. We talked about this at great length last time. I'm not sure really need to go into it all that much more. I will just point out here that based on feedback that we received last time, we are thinking it's appropriate to create kind of a list of facilities or facility types that are the things that we'll be looking at as being able to potentially satisfy the conditions of a compelling public interest, thinking more in terms of a categorical definition as opposed to something broader. And we're going to talk to you a lot more about that, understanding that's a key piece of this entire effort at our last meeting in June. And then, the final piece of this, or we're now labeling it 3B, are potential permit conditions for facility expansions, Title V renewals, or new facilities. That's not really what I meant there. And basically just the conditions that we might place on those types of facilities, since the bill does not empower the department to deny those types of applications. So next thing, we're going to just lay out in a little bit of detail for folks, just to provide some background and some context, what the statute talks about in terms of timing. And this is a day 0 type thing, which the smart people in our office, that's the type of language they like to use. So we're going to go with that. So basically, day 0 is the day, as called for in the law, where the environmental justice impact statement is prepared. So the way that the timeline is laid out in the statute, all time prior to day 0 is really time that the department's not involved, but where a facility would be working on preparing a potential environmental justice impact statement, as well as reviewing that publicly available data on our website, using the mapping tool to make some frontline and initial assessments about what the environmental stressors are that are present in a given overburdened community. When we move on to day 0, that is the time when the environmental justice impact statement is prepared. and ultimately in accordance with the law published on the DEP website, provided to the municipality with notice of a public hearing and public comment period. That notice being circulated in 2 newspapers in the overburdened community, 1 non-English language newspaper, as well as copies placed on the DEP website and the DEP bulletin, and another copy given to the municipality. That notice, of course, sets forth the time, location, and date of the public hearing, a description of the project, includes maps indicating the location of the facility, a summary of the environmental justice impact statement, how to obtain a copy, how to submit written comments, and then there's a catch-all there for other information deemed appropriate by the department. And then we move on to kind of 60 days later. We're required to give 60 days notice of the public hearing. Is that public hearing in the overburdened community? That in that hearing, the applicant provides a clear, accurate, and complete information about the proposed project, talks about the potential environmental or public health stressors associated with the facility, and is required to accept written and oral comments from any interested party, and provide an opportunity for, in the words of the statute, meaningful public participation, including inviting individuals or representatives from the municipality. 10 days later, or day 70, after the hearing, a transcript of the hearing, including all of the comments received, is to be provided to the department. It's around this time, in the 60 to 70 range, in accordance with the legislation. The department is first allowed to consider an application administratively complete, where an environmental justice impact statement would be required. So just kind of pointing out that there is a bunch of process that is called for in the bill that happens before the department even engages in what people would understand to be its traditional permitting posture. On day 105, or 45 days after the public hearing, the department is first empowered to issue a decision. Now, considering that an application is not administratively complete until approximately day 60 or 70, 45 days may not be an issue, but that's just what the statute sets out in terms of the limitations on the department's ability to make decisions. That in making that decision, the department considers the environmental justice impact statement and any other relevant information, including testimony and written comments received at the public hearing. If there are multiple permits, this process is only required once. We're not going to be doing, if you have an error in a solid waste or an error in a watershed land management permit, we're not going to require multiple environmental justice impact statement public hearings or public comment periods. We'll be able to consolidate that into one that goes over the entire project. But it's worth noting that the department does have discretion to require additional hearings due to the complexity of the application. I think that we're going to talk a little bit about that later on in terms of where and how that might be appropriate. We're certainly interested in hearing your thoughts. So that's the background as we see it. And let's just talk a little bit about the potential elements of the environmental justice impact statement. So statute provides, I'm sure you've all read it, that an environmental justice impact statement must assess the potential environmental and public health stressors associated with the proposed new or expanded facility, including any adverse environmental or public health stressors that cannot be avoided if the permit is granted, and the environmental or public health stressors already borne by the overburdened community. So 3 major themes here. First, the stressors borne by the OBC. Second, the potential stressors associated with the facility. And third, measures to avoid those stressors. Those pretty clearly come from the bill. We're going to just talk a little bit about how we might outline a bit of a preliminary list of requirements. And I think at that point, we're going to open up for questions. I think we're going to be in a position to want to hear from folks. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is just kind of a list of 7 things we're thinking about for inclusion, largely coming from the language that we just talked about. Basically kind of general questions for folks as we're going through these. If you have any questions on what these elements look like, I'll walk through at least our impression of what we think they are. But also, are there things that are missing from this list in your minds, or are there things that should not be included or things that should be modified? That's really, the 3 kind of baseline questions, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the finer details of impact statements and provide a couple of examples that we can walk through. So starting at the top, that first requirement, that's an analysis of the environmental and public health stresses already borne by the overburdened community. We've talked about that pretty substantially already. That would be something that's likely done using our publicly available data tool to assess the stressor levels related to the geographic point of comparison, and allow the facility to use that, what we hope to be objective and easily available information to make those first level assessments. Similarly, a determination of the environmental public health stressors that are higher than geographic point of comparison, pretty much the same thing, using that tool, being able to compare to the appropriate geographic unit and make an assessment about which of those stressors are higher than. Requirement number 3 is an analysis of the potential environmental and public health stressors associated with the proposed new or expanded facility or existing major source, right? So in that situation, a facility is looking at its overall operation and assessing what additional stressors it might bring to an overburdened community. So, operationally, are you going to be adding a point source of water pollution? Are you going to be contributing to noise, odors, potential or actual contributions to noise or odors? Is that facility going to include or increase mobile sources or stationary sources of air emissions? Is it going to be contributing stormwater to a CSO community? Those are the types of questions that we'll outline in the regulations, but those are the kinds of things where if you're trying to orient yourself in terms of what a facility you operate or facility you represent might be needing to consider, those are the types of things they're going to need to consider. They're going to need to break down their operations and look at the different pieces of them and determine where and how those operations might contribute to stressor levels. Requirement number 4, an analysis of how those potential stressors will cause or contribute to the stressors already borne by the overburdened community. So basically you're building on the first 3 steps, and a facility would be taking those operational conditions that we've talked about and comparing them to the stressor levels and asking, is that facility contributing to a stressor that is already higher than the geographic point of comparison? Or is it contributing to a stressor in a way where that additional contribution will end up with that stressor being higher than the geographic point of comparison? Once that analysis is undertaken, you go to 5. And that's where we would talk about measures that the facility would put in place to avoid those contributions. How can it adjust its operations to avoid contributing to those stressors? It's a fairly broad category. That's a case-by-case analysis. That's not something that we can necessarily provide a tremendous amount of guidance on given the permutations, but we will aim to put as much specificity in the rules as possible to guide folks so that they understand objectively what the department will be asked them to do as far as avoidance measures. As we've talked about last time in number 6, and this is something that we believe is extremely important. If an applicant is seeking to demonstrate a compelling public interest, the EJIS, the Environmental Justice Impact Statement, the public hearing, public comment, would require the facility to outline the basis for that position and give individuals in an overburdened community an opportunity to comment on and consider how that facility is proposing to fit within that categorical definition of an appropriate facility and what conditions it would propose to avoid or minimize its impacts or otherwise improve conditions in the OBC. I think that language is consistent largely with what we talked about last time in terms of what we'd be expecting of folks in an effort to demonstrate a compelling public interest, but we do think it's really important, obviously important and critical to this process that any pitch to fit within the definition of a compelling public interest is appropriately vetted by the community, put in front of interested parties, and we're able to get feedback on how that works and whether the community is on board essentially with that proposal. I'm going to pause for like 20 seconds here just to see if anybody has any questions on any of these elements before we move on to 7, which are other elements or points of analysis from other existing impact statements. We're going to give you a couple examples and walk through that. So we'll just talk about the first 6 or so, or basically anything anybody wants to talk about.
Ray?
There we go.
Thank you, Sean, Olivia. Can you hear me?
Sure can. Good morning, Ray.
Sure. I'm just a little bit confused about the comparison. Is the ultimate issue of stressors one of cumulative comparison, or is it stressor by stressor comparison? In other words, if one area may have more stressors of site remediation, or contaminated sites in the area, is that the point of comparison? Or is the cumulative of all stressors in an area compared to other areas? I thought it was cumulative, but you seem to be going on a stressor by stressor basis.
Well, so we're working on how we're going to handle, kind of the cumulative versus individual impacts. Now, I think what we're looking at and the direction we're pointing is that if we're to consider some sort of cumulative assessment of stressors, that may be part of that step one, part of that frontline assessment. But when you get down to a specific analysis of the contributions an individual facility might have, I think we're going to have to go through an individual stressor by stressor analysis. So we aim to create those data layers and create some conditions upon which facilities would need to go through an analysis to look at how they're going to contribute to, their operation might contribute to ozone, might contribute to particulate matter, might contribute to some of the other things. We're going to take a look at the list of stressors and make an assessment as to which are appropriate, because I think some of the things that we would be looking at don't necessarily match up to operational concerns, but remain relevant to an accurate assessment of environmental and public health stressors in a given overburdened community. So it may be both.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Next, we have a question from Toby Hanna.
Thank you, Olivia. Hi, Sean. Good, very thorough presentation as usual. That I had maybe some comments and questions on the earlier slides, but I'll wait for that. And just to answer your question on comments for this one, do you envision maybe relative comparisons of impact? You're coming into a community that already has environmental stressors. If you're adding 5% to that, if you're adding 55% to that, those are differences that I would think would matter. Is there a de minimis amount of addition that can be addressed and be kind of a bright line, maybe a target for companies to shoot for? That would certainly be part of the impact analysis, I would think, but I just don't see it quite that laid out here.
Yes, that's an interesting question. It's certainly been something we've been batting around internally. I mean, Toby, you know this stuff, and so I think it's a good opportunity to ask a question back. The bill talks about higher than, it talks about adverse cumulative impacts, and I think that those things are kind of part of this analysis. How would, from your perspective, how would the department go about setting some sort of de minimis threshold? I'm not really sure I necessarily see a clear and objective way to do that, but I'm interested in feedback on that particular issue if you think there is one.
Yeah, it's a complicated answer. I don't have all of it, Sean, but I would think it would relate to probably different for each stressor. Most of my background is air quality, and I can think more clearly there that we draw those we have those benchmarks, we have those comparison points already, and they're toxicity values, reference concentrations, relative, yours versus others. That's pretty common in clean air evaluations to show and there is a cumulative impact process from a criteria pollutant standpoint under the Clean Air Act. So you're basically looking at your contribution versus contributions of others to an exceedance of an air quality standard. And if you're insignificant, that's a very bright line, and it is a target that companies try to design toward. So it helps manage toward good outcome for everybody. So I can't give you a lot of detail on there, but there's certainly a Clean Air Act model there that could help.
Okay. Yeah, I think the challenge we have on this particular issue, as we've thought about it, is I think the bill really does attempt to recognize, I think pretty clearly recognizes that the presence of additional facilities is in and of itself a stressor, right? And that the facilities who are going to bring additional stressors to a community that's already overburdened can be considered a problem in and of themselves. And I think that's part of where, when we get into questions about de minimis thresholds, about kind of, almost kind of, more finely parsing contribution, it gets a bit more challenging. But I think your point's well taken. I think it's something we're gonna have to consider over the next bit of time, and we'll come back with something to you guys.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Kevin Whitney.
Sure, let me check the chat. Kevin asks, there is a limitation for a decision no less than 45 days after public hearing. Is there any plan for a DEP limitation for a decision to be made no more than XX days? So, so Kevin's fair question. In that situation, we would rely on the underlying environmental rules in place and regulations in place that govern our decision making. So, in certain situations, when you're dealing with land development permits, those are governed by the 90-day law. But largely, when we're looking at air permits, as I understand it, most of those do not contain outer limits on decision making because of the fine and also extensive analysis that is required to address that type of permitting. So I don't think we're going to be putting a limitation on the back end as part of the environmental justice regulations. I think that we would still be relying on, from a permitting perspective, the underlying and long-standing permitting processes. All right, we got to thank you. We've answered that question. We will move forward. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about more what we're hitting in kind of requirement 7 on this slide. We can go to the next one here. And these are just two existing examples of impact analyses that we've just kind of looked at, really just as a framework and something that we might be able to draw from to have ideas in terms of how we pretty much, mechanically set up what an environmental justice impact statement should really look like. So 2 examples on the screen. I'm going to ask you some questions on those, not dissimilar to what we've talked about already in terms of the types of feedback we'd like, but I'll walk through kind of what these things are. Now, I'll caveat that these are, the first one in specifics is from our solid waste rules. So some of the things are not broadly applicable, but we do think it's beneficial from a framing or context standpoint. So process 1, which we put on the screen here, that's derived, as I said, from the department's solid waste rules, and it's the requirements for an environmental and health impact statements recording disposal activities. Under the solid waste rules, an EJIS is prepared using a systematic interdisciplinary approach in order to ensure the integrated assessment of technical, economic, and social parameters potentially affected by a proposed facility. That is very, very good and fancy language, but let's break down what that actually means in practice. So we've listed out kind of generally what those elements are, and I'll just kind of walk through very brief descriptions just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. And we're going to ask you kind of which of these things make sense, which of these things don't make sense, and which might be a major problem or a major opportunity for folks. So first, administrative descriptive information maps. We've talked about that. Something like an executive summary describing the proposed facility. That's something I think is pretty easy. We move on to what the EJIS calls an environmental summary. That considers physical or chemical impacts that we'd be looking at geology, soil types, subsurface hydrology, water bodies, tributaries, topography, climate, ambient air quality, ambient acoustical conditions, in layman's terms, noise levels, biological, ecological characteristics, so plants, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, T&E species, critical or unusual habitat, ecosystem, biotic community, cultural resources, so recreational activities and aesthetics, socioeconomic considerations, so transportation facilities, sewage facilities, stormwater management facilities, water supply, electric supply, property values, public services, and community and residential dwellings. So very kind of broad analysis of the area in and around the facility. We would also, in this particular situation, be looking at the proposed facility operations, not dissimilar to what we've talked about already, description, the purpose of the facility, an economic analysis, waste streams, construction schedule, process narrative, basically laying out how the facility is going to operate. I think that stuff is likely to be highly relevant to what we'd be talking about under environmental justice impact statement. Number 4, we're looking at federal, state, county, and local land use connections. That's pretty much in line with number 6 here, license, permits, and condition and certifications. Those are really, the presence and compliance with local and state and federal land use and environmental regulations. So things like tidelands, wetlands, critical habitat, all of the things that are part of that general permitting process, basically a recitation of the other permits that would be required in order to move forward with the project. solid waste district, solid waste and sludge management plans, maybe a little bit more specific to a solid waste facility, but just something to at least note as part of this environmental assessment. So that would consider positive and negative impacts, modeling techniques, potential for contaminant migration, as well as a quantification of impacts and avoidance techniques, as we've talked about. Health impact assessment, considering, including a recitation of methodology, level of uncertainty, potential contaminants used to assess health risks, toxicity profiles, basically kind of a full assessment of the potential health impacts of the facility. And then we talked about potential and existing adverse impacts from those assessments. So unavoidable impacts and the measures that folks would put in place to avoid any impacts that they can. And then number 10 here, even though they're not numbered, they're numbered on my sheet, reasonable design alternatives. Includes a no action alternative, as well as alternatives in design, siting, process changes that are feasible, economic analysis, and how those alternatives might affect some of the other things we've talked about. Basically kind of a comparison matrix of this is the alternative we're proposing, these are what those other alternatives might look like and how they would impact some of the things that we've already talked about. The second process, at the risk of being too wordy at this point, is from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, and that it comes from their environmental justice siting analysis for major electric generating facilities. So basically, this is not all that different, but gives just a little bit of a different twist and a little bit of different flavor on what an impact statement can look like. Similarly, containing an administrative and descriptive information, a narrative of the project. This particular analysis would require cumulative impact analysis of air quality, kind of talking what we've talked about before, an examination of all the pollutants and examination of those impacts on those pollutants on stressor levels, as well as identifying the appropriate comparison area. Geographic point of comparison is certainly something we're looking at, and then comprehensive demographic, economic and physical description. So that will be drawing from available data to pull together information on the demographic and economic information of a particular block group, population rate, race, ethnicity, income, data on the physical properties, public health data, air quality, concentration of facilities, open space, historic and cultural resources, visual aesthetic resources, any other information that might be reasonably necessary to provide basically a complete and accurate description of the area. That process also requires an evaluation of significant and adverse disproportionate environmental impacts. Again, probably pretty similar to what we're talking about here, using available information and accepted methods to evaluate what those impacts might be on the area in question, comparing and contrasting that and discussing potential reasonable alternative locations and identifying those avoidance measures to address those impacts. And then finally, in this particular impact statement, it calls for a statement of environmental justice issues, which is a very broad statement, but basically amounts to a final environmental justice analysis that includes evaluation of those impacts, a rationale for the conclusions that the facility might be proposing in terms of what they're going to do, and again, how it would avoid those impacts. So some of these things line up pretty well with what we've been talking about. Some of them might have things that are kind of in addition to the things we've already outlined. But I mean, we're interested in hearing from folks. If you're looking at these two processes, does one resonate as being more applicable generally or in specific parts? What, if anything, out of these processes should the department include? I think we've run through the 6 things that we're already kind of looking at, so we don't need to be redundant there. But in terms of these other things that we've not already talked about, do any of them make sense, or do any of them not make sense? Or the things that in the analysis that we've gone through that you think is not appropriate for environmental justice impact statement analysis under these regulations? And and I think more specifically, we've talked about this a little bit in the past, is a conversation of alternatives and what, if any, types of alternatives should be required to be included in environmental justice impact statement. And I think that is most specifically relevant to new facilities, but we're certainly interested in getting feedback on alternatives for design or expansion of existing facilities and how we might or might not address those pending feedback from folks. So those are the list of questions. I'm going to leave up these processes up for a minute just so folks have an opportunity to look back at what I've babbled on about for a while in answering those questions, but we'll stop for a moment and open it up.
Thank you so much. We do have one hand raised, but I haven't asked. If at this point, just to help with the integrity of our recording, before you give your remark, if you could just tell us what your organizational affiliation is, that would be very helpful. So we have a hand raised at the moment from Chris Whitehead. So can you tell us your organizational affiliation, and then the floor is yours. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean and Olivia. Chris Whitehead, I'm with Envirus Sciences. And just to follow up on a point you mentioned earlier, Sean, you mentioned that for a facility with multiple applicable permits, they wouldn't have to submit multiple impact statements. There'd be a consolidation. I was just wondering, are you envisioning a different format for the impact statement for a site that's consolidating as opposed to a site that might only have one applicable permit?
That's interesting. I think that there's probably, I think there's probably a difference in terms of the level of information we'd require, but I think we probably, each individual permit under the law is a trigger for this analysis, right? So whether you're seeking, major source air permit, whether you're seeking a land resource protection permit, each of those in and of themselves, are potential triggers for this analysis. So I don't think it would be a different level of detail. I think it would just be a matter of how in depth the analysis would require the facility to consider and explain each of its impacts under the individual permits, right? So, you'd have to, if you're seeking a major source air permit, you're going to need to address all the considerations and all the conditions of the major source air permit and efforts to minimize emissions. Where if you're just building a facility that isn't a major source but requires a land use permit, you aren't going to need to go through that type of analysis. So I think it's just a question of what's going to be included, but I think we're probably going to work to standardize the requirements and make this pretty straightforward in terms of what folks are going to have to do. In recognition of the fact that the bill does treat these individual permits pretty with a lot of parity, I should say.
Okay, makes sense.
Thank you, Chris. Next, Toby Hannah, we're going to call you again. And I know we know you well, but if you could still just identify your organization for those who may not know where you're from. Thank you so much.
Sure, happy to do that, Olivia. It's Toby Hannah from ERM, Environmental Consulting Firm. Sean, maybe 2 or 3 items here to think about specifically that might be helpful to include, and then I have a general comment as well. I see potential and existing adverse impacts from assessments. Sorry, there's a plane flying over. And I immediately think, what about the positive impacts? Should this be a net benefit review so that we can evaluate the pros and the cons? I guess that would be an obvious thing that you don't have to tell us to put that in the impact assessment. We'll put that in the impact assessment, but I'm interested to hear whether you're considering that and that the positive impacts are as well.
Yeah, I think that's something we've talked about a bit. It's something that we've received charitably mixed reviews on in terms of trying to have that conversation, trying to bring that information forward. So it's something that's on our minds. I think when you go into an individual stressor analysis, we'd have to see how that might fit there, because I think we do feel we have to be looking at these things as specifically as possible, as opposed to necessarily just considering things in the aggregate. So I don't know how that all will fit together, but it's a fair point and certainly something that's on our mind.
Another thing, maybe along those lines, but I think it's important when we do impact assessments all over the world for different reasons, and there's a lot of standards for those impact assessments, as you probably well know. One of the things that you would typically also include would be existing regulations, hard enforced regulatory requirements that you're already subject to, and meeting protections that are already in place, if you will. I think those are important to summarize and refer to especially the relevant ones if they're related to the stressors that are disproportionately high. You have any comments on that? But yeah, okay. And then my last higher level comment or suggestion is, can't tell from what you've presented and what we've talked about, what's in the legislation, whether DEP is actually going to issue a guidance document, a model impact assessment, so that there's some predictability both for the communities and for the companies on what this should look like. And I thought back to your day 0 to day 105 process of how possible is it that gets derailed because the department doesn't think we did the impact assessment that we've done. And can you talk a little bit about that? And is there any enlightenment that you can provide there, or maybe we can provide some more comment to help with that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I mean, so the rules will take us so far, right? We're going to aim to be as specific as possible in outlining, regulatorily what we would expect to see in an impact statement, down to as fine detail as we can. But this might be and is likely a place where some guidance or some templates or some of those other things are appropriate, so that we can try to standardize the process. People know what to expect. People know what to prepare. We're going to get into a little bit of that as we go through other considerations. But one of the questions is to what extent should the department be involved in the review of an environmental just impact statement before you go to public hearing, right? So we do not want to create a situation where we have an unnecessarily iterative process, right? Where we're coming back and saying, well, you didn't do this analysis right, now you have to start all over. Like that's not to anyone's benefit, and that's not what we're after. We also don't want to put too much process in place that is going to slow down even the pre-permitting part of the analysis. So we're going to have to strike a balance there. I think that guidance and some kind of format will go part of the way, but we're going to talk about, and we will talk about today, just how much should we be reviewing and giving the go ahead that this is at least sufficient for the department's purposes in terms of the completeness of analysis. So yeah, for sure.
I saw those questions in the slides.
Yeah.
So it's I guess that's a pretty ripe area for stakeholder involvement if you're going to talk about a guidance or a model. That would be something that you'd want to get a lot of input on.
If you ask anybody I work with, I love templates, I love guidance, and I love all models. So I think that you've got a sympathetic ear here for something along those lines.
Good deal. Okay, thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Toby. Next, back to Ray Cantor. And Ray, again, if you could just identify your organization before you give additional remarks. Thank you.
Yes, Olivia. Ray Cantor with the New Jersey Business and Industry Association. There is a lot to unpack here, so I'm definitely going to have to spend more time looking at what you've put forth and sending you more detailed comments on that. It seems to be a little bit away from where I thought the department was going when you were looking at your cumulative impact analysis to begin with, where we're using publicly available information. You were providing an initial ranking criteria and weighing that against other communities. I'm not sure in this analysis, to the extent you're looking at additional assessments that are not otherwise provided or required under the permit, are you looking for those assessments as to what that particular emission or pollutant addition means in and of itself, or are you looking for how that relates to the overall cumulative number of stressors, which is something we talked about early on, that there really wasn't any science to determine how an additional underground storage tank, in an area, or additional amount of water pollution relates to site remediation, relates to air. So I'm not entirely sure what you're asking for, and I'm not entirely sure, other than providing information to the community, which can be valuable to a certain extent, the impact analysis in the EJIS statement doesn't really get to the ultimate decisions by the department, which is really a comparative analysis of overburdening communities one to another. So I'm not sure what you're looking for, and I've thrown a bunch of uncertainties out there. So I'm not sure if you can respond to that.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. So I think the last part of your statement is the most consistent with what we're talking about, which is that comparative analysis, right? So, you know, I'm not enough of a data scientist or a cumulative impact scientist to necessarily debate, you know, how viable that cumulative impact analysis really is. But I am versed enough in the law, I think, this particular law, to understand that we're able to do more of a comparative analysis, right? So what we would be looking at is looking at the individual stressors or cumulative stressors, depending on where we are in a process, and considering whether those stressors are higher than the geographic point of comparison. So that when you look at your list of stressors, the ones that are higher or the ones that are close are likely to be the ones that are most relevant and would require the deepest level of analysis for a given facility, considering their contributions and whether that will contribute to a continuation of that stressor being higher than the point of comparison, or might lead to that stressor being higher than the point of comparison, as opposed to going through a more difficult and extensive cumulative impact analysis. I don't think we're going to ask folks to do that. We're going to stay in line with the law and talk about comparison and disproportionate impact, and then ask folks to go through a finer analysis of their contributions to those areas where there is a disproportionate impact, or where that facility might lead to one. And leading to one means creating stressors that are above that geographic point of comparison. So it really ends up being kind of laying out, you know, potentially in the spreadsheet, like these are the stressor levels in the community. This is what my facility will bring to the community, and this is where that ends up if you consider my contributions, and where does that leave you in relation to the point of comparison?
So Sean, again, and the devil's always going to be in the details, and this is a highly complex area.
Mm-hmm.
So let's assume a certain area has 10 stressors from 10 different, different sources, and they're now going to add a new facility, and that new facility is going to have a relatively small amount of water pollution discharge, which would meet all otherwise standards. What are they assessing? Whether or not that water discharge is going to have a health impact or environmental impact? We already know it meets all standards. So I'm not really sure what you're comparing at that context.
We'd be looking at, so I think what we're going to end up with are likely kind of percentile numbers in terms of where individual communities sit in the relative percentile of pollution or stressors. So if your facility is going to have a point source water pollution discharge, you're going to need to look at what the amount of that is and how it does or doesn't change the percentile rank of the particular community with regard to that stressor, not to assess what the specific impact on health is to that of that discharge, but rather how it affects its relation to its point of comparison.
So again, and I'll stop after this point. Mm-hmm. If I hear you correctly, and this relates back to my earlier question about individual stressors versus the cumulative and the ranking, you're now saying once you come into the system, because your community is determined to be overly burdened with stressors, you're now going to look at stressor by stressor comparison, and if there are 10 stressors, if one of them is adding more higher than ranks everywhere else, you're now out of the box. So it's no longer a cumulative assessment, it's now cumulative first, but then individual afterwards.
We haven't made the decision in terms of whether the contribution of one stressor is going to be sufficient for that. We're talking about the specifics of how we would go through the analysis. Those decisions about how we demonstrate cumulative adverse impacts, which is kind of part of what the law looks like, is something that we're looking at and we'll talk about more in June. But all your points are well taken. This is exactly the type questions we are asking ourselves currently. I mean, I take it from your comments that, or from your comments, are you saying that contribution to one stressor would not be sufficient in your mind to demonstrate average cumulative impact?
Yeah, I thought, again, and I'll send more detailed comments. I'd love to continue this conversation, but I thought we were looking for a system that just looked at comparing the stressors between different communities, which rank different stressors based on whatever type of ranking system is there, and it was a more simple process of determining if you're, adding to or not adding to, and and then having mitigation or whatever else afterwards. I didn't, what you're looking at here seems to be a much more complicated analyses that I'm not sure is doable, or that is consistent with the law. In fact, either.
I think it's detailed. We don't aim to make it overly complicated, but I understand your point, Ray.
Thank you, Ray. So we have 2 more hands raised and 1 question in the chat. So the next person is John Reed Green. If you can just identify your organization and then give your remarks. Thank you.
Sure. This is Doug Reed Green from BASF Corporation. My question is, will this analysis carry over into permits that are required for remediation systems? So if a site is undergoing remediation and there's a need for an air permit or a water discharge permit, will that remediation system need to follow this impact analysis?
So the bill does exclude permits necessary for remediation. So if those permits are exclusively for the purposes of remediation, I don't believe that it will be covered by that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you. And there's 1 question in the chat from Michael Fesson. I'm not sure of his organizational affiliation, but his question asks if there will be an advocate assigned to the applicant.
Sure. So I'm Michael, correct if I'm wrong. The use of the word advocate, I think I'm going to interpret to mean is there going to be, well, maybe if you're available, you can help me to understand that. I'm not certain if you're talking about an advocate as in somebody in the community who would be assigned to the applicant, or whether you're talking about somebody from inside the department who would be working to ensure coordination internally on our review. If it's the former, I don't think, the department's not going to be in a position to be kind of matching up individuals in the community with applicants in terms of making sure that the applicants are hearing from folks in the community ultimately, that we believe that is both good corporate citizenship, as well as something that's going to be required in order to be able to accurately assess the concerns of the community. If the question is with regard to how the department would be handling internal coordination of all of these individual pieces and analysis, I think the answer is somewhat yes. We're working to set up kind of a consolidated and front-end environmental justice permitting process that will likely work either through or similar to our Office of Permit Navigation, which we've had a ton of success with in terms of taking extremely complicated permits and being able to run them through multiple lines of divisions and bureaus, and being able to pull all that together into one coherent decision. That would be how the department would intend to approach these, so that everything is moving together and any decision that is issued specifically with regard to any of the environmental justice considerations is consistent with the underlying permit conditions and vice versa. So I've answered it both ways. Hopefully one of those is nearing correct. But if I haven't, please feel free to speak up.
Yeah, my question was the latter.
Okay.
Actually, for it, and the follow up to that is there a cumulative impact of permit denial as part of the standard?
If for new facilities, as part of, if you run through this process, we haven't hit all of the specific decision points, but generally speaking, if impacts cannot be avoided pending a bunch of sub decisions there for new facilities, if it's not a compelling public interest, then there's a denial, and that denial will be issued by the commissioner, and would be likely a denial specific to the environmental justice regulations as opposed to an underlying permit.
I'm not sure if that answers it. Well, if there's a cumulative impact of the denial, what that means to the community if the permit is denied, what does that mean? I'm in the railroad business. We deliver products and cargo to all kinds of people.
Oh, I see. Okay, so in terms of the assessment, what would be the negative impacts on the specific community of the denial? Is that what you're getting at?
Right.
Yes.
And if that is part and parcel of the study, and if that is part and parcel of the report of the final environmental justice report.
I think that so when we're considering the elements of environmental justice impact statement, I think that's something that whether we ask for it or not, folks are going to tell us. So I probably want to put that in there so we're at least clear about it. As far as how the department would deal with those, potential adverse impacts of the denial, I think that would go into a consideration of a compelling public interest on a new facility, and we'd be looking at whether that type of facility meets the categorical definition, and then considering kind of that the potential benefits that would be brought, which is really kind of the inverse of the adverse impacts of the denial, as part of how we would look at that analysis. But it's something we're still working on, something we're going to need to provide more clarity on at our next meeting. But thank you for raising it.
All right, I would just ask that be made formally part of the process, so that it needs to be completed no matter which applicant is there for that. So that would be my ask.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're good to go.
All right, so we will move forward. All right, so let's get into some of just kind of the other considerations we're talking about. We can go to ahead. All right, so this gets into a bit less focused on the specifics of an environmental justice impact statement and more focused on the process around that, the public hearing, the public comment. So we have some questions up on the screen that I'll just read through, and if folks have input there, we're going to go through a couple of other similar ones as we move through the back end of this presentation. So, the first question we tend to ask broader questions to try to spur conversation and thought is basically how can a department ensure meaningful public participation in the EJIS process, right? We have notice called for by the statute. We have a public hearing in the overburden community. How do we set that up to ensure that folks are getting something out of it on both sides, right? The applicant needs to be able to understand and address the concerns of the community, and the community needs to be able to understand what the project is, what it means, and be able to properly voice their concerns. In order to match up those two sides of the equation, we need to ensure meaningful public participation, and we're interested in folks, giving us any feedback they have in terms of how we can make sure that occurs. Some of the sub questions there are the statutory methods of notice, which is, as I indicated earlier, 2 newspapers, 1 local non-English, providing copies of the environmental justice impact statement and the notices on the DEP website, notice in the DEP bulletin. Is that sufficient? As we are sitting in the year 2021 and continuing to work remotely, and largely probably most of us not even using paper anymore, our newspaper is the most effective way to do this. Should we be looking at other ways to reach the community? Are there better ways to publicize this information to ensure that the folks most in need of this information are at those hearings, so that the applicants can understand what their concerns are? I think understanding that a lack of notice and a lack of participation in those meetings can be fatal when folks get around to understanding what the potential project is and start making their voices heard after the formal part of that process is concluded. That can certainly be a highly complicating factor for any potential applicant. And how should we determine, which languages notice should be translated into? And then again, talking about the methods of making that environmental justice impact statement available. We're supposed, the law requires it to be provided to the governing body and the clerk and to put on the website. Are there other things we should be looking at? And then something that, I think Toby and I talked about a little bit already, and this kind of touches on that, is, but to what extent should the department be participating in the environmental justice impact statement public hearing? We're not required to under the law. We may have an option to be there. We might have an option to be there in some capacity. We would certainly be careful in terms of considering what our participation should be, but we're definitely interested in hearing from folks if you have any particular feedback on any of these questions, and we'll go through a couple more that are in a similar vein.
Okay, we have one hand up from Chris Whitehead. I think Chris lowered his hand. Chris, if I made a mistake, certainly just raise it again and we will call you back. So we will go to Dave Brewster, and Dave, be sure to let us know your organizational affiliation before you give remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia. This is David Brewster with PARS Environmental. Just a question regarding your last bullet point there, Sean. Sure. So I understand DEP might want to be a little kind of hands-off, but if the public hearing is part of this permit decision process, shouldn't DEP be involved with those public hearings just to at least monitor to see how the community is responding and what types of issues that they may be bringing up that might be important to your DEP's decision process?
Yeah, David, that's an excellent point. Something that we had kind of been talking about recently, and I'm glad you gave an opportunity for us to provide a little bit more context here. Does it make sense for the department to attend a public hearing and to, from a neutral perspective, lay out what the environmental justice impact statement process is for folks, right? I mean, I think we both have an interest in ensuring that this process runs smoothly, ensuring that there's clarity on what each of the steps means. And I think, more broadly, and to your point, I think there is some benefit to be gained from the department being in the room and hearing directly from both the applicant and from members of the community, as it is ultimately required to make any decisions here. And there is likely something to be gained that that would not be reflected in a transcript or a written response to comments. So that point is well taken, and it's something that we're very much considering.
Just one final other comment too, just in terms of DEP being a neutral participant, it would be good also for the community to hear what the DEP's perspective would be, not necessarily like positive or negative towards the particular permit, but just to explain the legal, what DEP's role is in this legal process and what that legal process is, so the communities understand as well, those legal points.
Yeah, I think that makes an incredible amount of sense.
Thank you. And next, Chris, we'll take you again.
Yeah, I apologize for the last one, Olivia. I had to go back on mute. Chris Whitehead, EnviroSciences. Just to your second point, Sean, I think it begs the obvious question, and to be honest, I'm not sure how I feel about this, but is the DEP considering some type of notice via social media to point to the website or newspaper for more information?
Yeah, I think we have to, right? I mean, I think we have to live in the year that we live in, which is one that is much more online and much more social media focused. And I think that part of the balance there is we're a big government institution. Not everybody pays attention to our Twitter or our Facebook or whatever online thing we have, right? So we want to make sure that we're finding ultimately the best ways to get the message, to get the information in front of folks. And we could amplify a bulletin publication with a note on our DEP social media accounts. That might be beneficial. I think we'll ultimately be looking to maybe dig a little deeper here, and whether there's a way through advocacy groups, or whether there's a way that a particular applicant can set something up to get that information as directly as possible to the folks, but it's certainly all of that is on the table, and all of that's, you know, in our minds and things we're considering.
Thank you. Toby Hanna?
Yeah, Toby Hanna from ERM. Sean, in terms of meaningful public engagement, I know that's a big goal, and
Yep.
then meaningful public participation in the EJIS process. Ideally, this would certainly be my advice to companies, and a lot of the companies I work with thinking this way already, that's happening along the way, and all parties, including DEP, are aware of the project's new or the renewal of the permit and the JIS process that's underway, and that there's engagement before a public understanding that the public requirement, but hopefully it's just another conversation like the other conversations they've had. So, you know, I've said this before. I think to the degree that we can put emphasis on that, incentives on that, and encourage that, I think that's really the outcome you want, not just nobody wants to have an adversarial public hearing, but it's more than that. It's getting some acceptance, getting input and feedback from the stakeholders, again, DEP included along the way. So that's not just I think there's something in the regulation that can be done there to make sure that you're incentivizing that and creating that, not just people doing the right thing, but because they know it is the right thing. That's a lot, but show some recognition of that in the regulations too. And I can't tell you quite where to put that or how to do it yet, because I can't see the real detail shape of what you're going to do with the regs. But maybe as we get farther into this, be able to help you place that a little more.
That is, I'm sorry. I mean, I would keep going.
Yeah, go ahead.
Then I'll compliment.
I was just going to say, in terms of spreading the word, I think the rest of your comments here is, that happens these days just fine. I think better than ever. The newspaper, yeah, your website, yeah, you put it on your different external links, and the communities that care are already on it, and that word's going to get around, and the facility should be reaching out to their community stakeholders direct to. But I don't know that you need how much of that you really need to mandate or worry too much about. Word gets around these days. We all know better than it ever did. So not a strong push there, but more importantly, that meaningful public engagement be happening early on, and the EJIS and the public hearing just be a couple final steps along that road, not the first steps.
Yeah, that's excellent, and thank you. I mean, I think everything you said there is exactly what we're hoping for and what we're going for, right? And I think that continuing to remind ourselves that the goal is for the regulations the goal is not for the regulations to require these things, but for the regulations to incentivize and recognize the reality, which is that folks will be talking and should be talking before they even get to us, right? So love everything you said, and we're gonna do some work to try to make that part of what we're doing here. So thank you.
Thanks.
We're good to go. Thank you.
Let's go to the next one. Hopefully labeled 2 out of 3, which means we're almost to the end, guys. So I'm just kind of continuing to go through some of this stuff. So question, should the regulations have a pre-application phase where, we talked about this already too, where the department determines if an EJIS is sufficient? Should the department be able to request revisions or provide guidance in the acceptability of an EJIS after the applicant has submitted it to the public, after it's been distributed? Like, how do we ensure sufficiency of an environmental justice impact statement as early in the process as possible, so that we can avoid any repetition in terms of what we need to do here? Should the final environmental justice impact statement be included in the permit issued? Where or when is it appropriate for the department to require additional public hearings? Should we require an applicant to provide written responses to comments received during the public comment period or at the public hearing? I tend to think that that's something that's appropriate. Otherwise, A bunch of unanswered comments doesn't really do anybody any good. And should there be an additional or kind of continuation of public comment period after the public hearing? So, as we've done kind of the day zero chart, from 0 to 60, you're providing notice of the public hearing, you're providing a place to provide comments. Should there be some time after that where individuals can provide additional feedback based on what they've heard at a public hearing? I mean, I think that, we often run into that issue where folks are, understand things differently after they hear the presentation. That is, after all, the point of that public hearing. So should there be time post that hearing for folks to be able to provide additional comments that might inform some of the decisions that an applicant and/or the department might make. So those are the questions that are teed up for this. Any feedback there? And if not, we will move on to our final slide for today's conversation.
Okay, Chris Whitehead.
Thank you, Olivia. Chris Whitehead, Envirosciences. To your first point there, Sean, I think having the model or template EJIS would be extremely valuable up front, and especially because this is brand new and a little bit of a learning process for sites. I think a pre-application phase could be valuable for this, but not necessarily required. But again, having that template could be extremely valuable. So I definitely encourage that.
Excellent, thank you, Chris. And as part of that pre-application fees, potential pre-application fees that we talked about too is kind of applicability determination, where folks might be able to get you're be able to look at that publicly available data and make a first line assessment of whether what the requirements would be to seek a permit in a particular community. But I think from the department's perspective, I think it's incumbent upon us to be able to provide some level of confirmation of that information, so folks know and have certainty on what their requirements and what we'd be asking them to do in a particular community. So I think that's something that could be part of that as well. All right, let's go to the last slide, and then we'll save as much time as necessary for general comments at the end. So this is really just a couple of questions which are pretty much in line, but what type of support or guidance, and I think we may have covered this at this point, should the department be providing both, I think, to the applicant and potentially also to members of the community, right? You need to be able to have information that is understandable to folks, and it cannot be too technical, and it cannot be beyond people's ability to understand if they're going to engage meaningfully. So that's just something that we're asking: are there things that the department should be doing to help folks to understand this, both on the side of the industry as well as what is going on here? Our screen appears to have changed, guys. There we go. So just, generally speaking, anybody want to weigh in on this? Otherwise, we'll go directly to open session or open season. And anything else folks want to raise before we call it a day?
Okay, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, one more. Just off of that, is there any thought to giving a type of summary statement with the EJIS that makes it a little more plain English and not as technical, a little more accessible for folks?
It's a good point. Yeah, that's something that's something we're gonna have to consider. And I think that there's potential space in terms of what the environmental impact statement requires, as well as the department's role in this, as well as, I think it's tying a bunch of the things we've looked at, potentially included in how we might put together guidance or kind of a template or something like that would help folks understand what we're talking about. So it's another good point, Chris. Thank you.
Okay, Toby.
Thanks, Olivia. Toby from ERM. Yeah, both the model or guidance, Sean, is helpful, and in the spirit of meaningful engagement, that communication, for that to happen effectively, it has to be understandable. It can't be the highly technical. So again, if everybody's doing this the right way, they're communicating well with their stakeholders in advance, and they're communicating well with their stakeholders through this EJIS and public hearing process. And it's just up to you to get the regulations straight to enable that, and that. Give some credit for that. If it's really happening, what's the incentive? Other than hopefully they get their permit that they need. But I think that's the big part of the answer there too. Just it follows through right down to being able to see it effectively and understand.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you, Toby.
Thank you. Brad Sims. Make sure to unmute yourself, Brad.
Brad Sims, I'm with ExxonMobil. I want to support the two prior suggestions of guidance and templates. And in my experience, another element that might be helpful is a frequently asked questions or FAQ document, because I feel like we're going to find some themes of questions and topics that are going to keep coming up, and an FAQ is oftentimes helpful in kind of an evergreen collection of responses to common themes we're going to find with this process going forward.
Another excellent point. Thank you, Brad. Anyone else? All right. Well, as I always say, Olivia, I think we wore them down. So this is it. These are the last bits here. Please, as Ray indicated, and we certainly recognize these. There's always a lot that we present, and given the speed with which we need to work here, you don't always have a ton of time to analyze everything. So we welcome and look forward to your written comments or anything else you'd like to provide us. The email address is there, and we're always looking for those. And if you can't get, if you have further questions or anything, you can always get to Olivia or I, and we're always happy to talk. So Olivia, I will give it back to you.
Oh, we thank you everyone for joining us. We thank you for the valuable feedback we received. And if you have any questions or comments, we look forward to hearing from you in the platforms that Sean mentioned. And otherwise, we will see you the week of June 21st. Thank you so much. Enjoy your day.
Thank you, everyone.